20 to 38. As usual, if you need a Bible and don't have one, there's some on the side. And also you can pull it up on your phones. We read in the NASB. Most versions should be fine. And as usual, I invite you to read along with me. Acts 27, verses 20 through 38. Let's read God's word together. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God whom I serve stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island.' But when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took some soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little further on they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea, on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourself cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them to all take some food, saying, 'Today is the 14th day that you've been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair of your head from any of you will perish.' Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons, and when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. We mentioned a couple weeks back that these last 7 chapters of the book of Acts is known as the sufferings of Paul. And the reason is because it's one life-threatening situation after the other. So far we've seen public beatings, right? He's been imprisoned, and then he's been in trial after trial in front of all these Roman leaders. But now, because Paul has made an appeal to be seen by the Roman Emperor Caesar himself, right, because that's his right as a Roman citizen, he is now headed to Rome. For 2 reasons. One, so that he might finally get a fair, unbiased trial that he's been seeking the whole entire time, but more importantly, so that he can finally preach God's word to the greatest city of that time, Rome herself. So Paul finds himself on a boat, as he has many times in his life, but this time he's on a boat with soldiers and sailors. Sailors to steer the boat and navigate the open seas, as you might imagine, and then soldiers to transport Paul and his fellow prisoners to Rome, because remember, he is a prisoner. And of course, because this is the sufferings of Paul, and that's what happens in Paul's life, his boat then gets caught in what's essentially a hurricane, a terrifying, life-threatening storm that's so bad that the sailors and everyone, we're told in verse 20, had given up all hope of being saved and or rescued. And so here, with 2 chapters left in the book of Acts, I know we've made it a long way, we're reminded again of a very familiar lesson throughout the book, that life in general, and especially a life of following Jesus, will unfortunately, but surely, have its fair share of suffering and storms. Which means then, how we navigate and survive such storms is critically important to the life of every single human being. Storms and sufferings are a part of life, period. But we need to learn how to navigate and survive them if we're going to be able to navigate and survive life well, right? And so thankfully, as Christians, the Bible teaches us exactly how to do this, interestingly enough. We have actually some storm stories, right? The story of Jonah, then there's Jesus and the disciples in Mark chapter 4, and then here Paul in the shipwreck. And then when it comes to suffering and difficulties in general, well, I feel like this theme or these stories and how-tos are practically on every page of the Bible. If you just want to take a catalog, just to name a few, stories that begin with the name J, there's Jacob, Joseph, Job, and Jesus, and on and so forth. It's all over the place. So then, church, as storms and sufferings are indeed a regular part of life in a very sinful and broken world that we live in, how Paul's shipwreck journey teaches us to navigate and survive storms is absolutely critical. And in this story, I think we learn two things about what it takes to survive and navigate storms of our life. And that's one, that we must remember God's plan, and then two, that we must rely upon God's presence. If we're going to navigate the storms of our life, we're going to need to remember God's plan, and then secondly, rely upon God's presence. Let's jump in, shall we? Before we do, I have to note, as you know, I read a lot of Timothy Keller's work. He's kind of the C.S. Lewis of our day, and so I'm very indebted to him for a lot of the stuff that I know. In particular, though, a lot of the stuff, his stuff on suffering and the theology of suffering has been really helpful to me, and so I wanted to mention that because a lot of this indeed comes from his overall kind of theology of suffering knowledge. But let's jump in, shall we? Remembering God's plan. As we said and as we read, things were looking quite bleak. Okay? Paul's ship was hopelessly floating in the open sea, in the middle of the Adriatic Sea, stuck in a hurricane-like storm. And as we mentioned in verse 20, they had abandoned all hope of being rescued. The sailors, because they're sailors, had tried for so long and so hard to fight the storm, but at this juncture, it had been a long time, and so they gave up hope, saying, it's over. Let's just mail it in. So it's in this place, when there was no hope and people thought they were going to die, that Paul then decides to speak up. In verse 21, he says this, when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, men, you ought to have followed my advice and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. By the way, Paul isn't being bitter. This isn't nagging, or in Korean we like to call it chansori. That's not what this is. He's actually mindfully reminding everyone that they had a choice and that they made the wrong one. And you'll see why this is important coming up. He had warned them earlier that it's way too dangerous to travel, and yet they did not listen to him. Verse 9 of chapter 27, we didn't read it, tells us that the time frame was about late October, okay? And everyone in that time and everyone in that area of the world knew that the time from late September to early November was the dangerous season that you generally do not travel unless you can avoid it, right? You don't travel unless you absolutely have to. And no one travels after early November. You just wait till the winter is over. And yet, they decided they had to go. So the smart thing was to not travel, but they went, and indeed, now they're in this mess. So he's reminding them, we had choices. We're not here just because of anything. We could have avoided this if we had taken my advice, but we didn't, and now here we are. So then he continues in verse 22. Yet now I urge you, I apologize, it's so small on the screen, to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. For this very night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. Okay, you got to make it to Rome. You have a goal and a task. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I've been told. Now, at this juncture, we have to take a moment and keep it real. Keep it 100 for a second. Now, when you're listening to a sermon like this, you're probably going, hey, this is really good news, right? They're all, they're in a mess of trouble in the middle of the ocean, and God's telling them it's going to be okay. And so for us, we're like, oh, that's really good on God. He's rescuing them. But if we then take it out of this sermon context in Paul's life and into our own life, I think we would look at this very differently. For instance, if I, as a pastor or any one of the church people here, said something like this to you in the middle, while you were in the middle of a storm that you couldn't see the end of, I think you would feel differently. I think you'd want to ridicule us or even call us certain things that you don't normally would call us. And I think you would say, deservedly so, we would get that kind of treatment. You might even go and be like, oh, you would say that, all you Christians and pastors. It's what's wrong with all of you. Everything is always about faith. Everything is always about God is in control. Everything is always about, it's going to be all right. God has got everything. Don't worry. Everything happens for a reason. That type of thinking. Well, frankly, I don't need what God told you right now. All I need is real solutions to my problems. This posture that we may hear a lot sounds kind of like the just trust God, everything's going to be all right because God told me so kind of posture. We can call it prayerful, we can call it faithful, some of us call it hardcore Christian kind of things. But the whole idea is, hey, don't worry, God's got a plan. And Paul essentially says this, doesn't he? For I believe, God, that it will turn out exactly as I've been told. If we're being honest and allowed ourselves to in the moment, I think in many ways, if someone looked at us in the middle of a storm like they're going through, we'd probably just want to roll our eyes and be like, oh my gosh, there he goes again. But interestingly, right after this, in verse 26, Paul says, but we must run aground on a certain island. He's saying, God told me last night that we're all going to live. Sorry, we're going to lose a ship, but we're all going to live. But do not lose hope. But at the same time, we better hurry up and get this ship on land, because if not, we're not going to make it. It's a very interesting, sober dose of reality in the midst of kind of his Christian faith talk, isn't it? Even later, actually, interestingly, the sailors who apparently thought that it's a lost fight, and they're like, we got to hurry up and get out of here. So they try to trick the people by lowering the lifeboat, pretending to do something else, right? And so they try to escape via the little lifeboat on the side of the boat. And then Paul sees what's happening and goes, no, we can't do this. So he goes to the soldiers, and the centurion goes, they're trying to escape out here, and unless they remain on the ship, we're not going to make it. AKA, if we don't have sailors, we can't navigate the ship, and we're all doomed and lost. So let's stop that before it happens. And what do? The soldiers go, oh, no, we can't have that. And then they actually cut the rope to the lifeboat, and they watch the lifeboat sail away, which is interesting. So on one hand, you have this Paul, prayerful and faithful Paul, right? God's in control. God's going to do his thing. We're going to be all right, Paul. And on the other hand, you have this practical and functional Paul saying, we got to do these things. We got to make sure we take care of our issues. If not, we're going to make it. And the thing I wonder is, don't these two postures and statements seem a bit off to you? Like they don't fit, as if they contradict one another in some ways? And if you feel that way, I think it's because we generally, in modern Christianity, it seems, have this idea that it's either got to be faith and trust or not. You either trust God and have faith in everything, or you simply don't. If you believe, then yeah, God has got it under control. It's going to be all right. Trust him. He's faithful. And then as an extension, we'll say, well, then it doesn't really matter what we do because God's got it under control, right? What about the sailors? I don't care about the sailors. Let them go. God's going to take care of it. But if you don't believe it and are on the other side, well, then it's what's God going to do, right? Of course we need the sailors. Of course we need these things. The only thing that matters in life is what we do and our consequences, because what is God going to do in this situation? Seriously. Now, I actually saw this play out a lot in the early parts of the pandemic, interestingly enough. People would come up to me, church folks, other people, and knowing that I'm a pastor, they'd be like, so Pete, I have a question for you. What is your thoughts on vaccination? And we're not getting into it, so don't worry, you'll see where this is going. And they go, because early on in the pandemic, I was praying, and God really made me feel like I shouldn't be afraid of COVID, right? Like God's got this, like it's going to be okay. That He's got us and our whole family, and that we're going to be all right. And so we decided, as a sign of our faith and trust in Him, that we're not going to get vaccinated, none of us in our family, right? And the idea is, well, if God's got us and we're trusting in Him, He's going to protect us, then what's the point of vaccination, right? We don't need it. But then as time went along, more and more people around them, family members, friends, and so on and so forth, started getting vaccinated, and then certain, offices and schools and things like that required it, yada, yada, yada. And so they started to kind of have a bit of an internal struggle. So then they would come up to me and go, so what should we do, right? And the idea was, if we get the vaccine now, they were saying, doesn't it mean that we're telling God that we don't trust Him anymore? That we're going back on the promise that we made to Him? And do you see the dichotomy here? On one hand, if you trust God, then it's saying, I don't need the vaccine. Why? Because God's got it. He's got it all under control. Whatever happens. It's cool. But on the other hand, if you do get the vaccine, well, it clearly means you don't trust God because He's not going to take care of you, right? Why do you need the vaccine in the first place? And you're probably understanding the difficulty here, right? Because we're kind of saying, wait, why can't it be both? Why can't I totally trust God's will in my life and at the same time do what I'm responsible for and try to do the responsible, healthy, medically approved thing, helpful for me and for others, right? But it seems oftentimes in our faith, it's either or. Again, either you believe and you trust or you don't. Either you believe and everything's going to turn out exactly as God says, or you believe that we have to dock and make sure the sailors don't jump ship because we have to do our part. It's either or and never a both and. But Paul here, interestingly, is teaching us that it is indeed both and. For the mathematically inclined people, the engineers in the room, it's the way that we look at it is it's either 100% God or 100% me. That's how it works. Or if you're a Christian and part of the group, you're saying it's 50% God and 50% me. If you're less presumptuous, you're like, no, it's 80% God and it's 20% me, right? However you look. But what Paul is saying is, no, it's none of those. It's actually 100% God and 100% me. As in, God is 100% in charge and His plan is always at work, and yet what we do absolutely 100% matters. That God's plan means that God is indeed in control. That everything that happens, good, bad, small, and large, are indeed determined by God, but at the same time, our choices and our actions, and therefore its consequences, matter. Period. Because we have freedom and responsibility to do as we please in this world. We actually see this principle being played out all throughout Scripture. Let me just give you two examples. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph looks at his family and says, what you meant for evil against me, God meant for good. Right? We all know this scripture for those of us who grew up in the church. And the Joseph story kind of goes like this. Let me give you a brief synopsis. Jacob, Joseph's father, had 12 sons, and his favorite was clearly Joseph. And so he naturally did what we do to favorites. You spoil them because that's why they're your favorites. And it wasn't good for the family. There were bad consequences. Joseph was a very spoiled, not very kind person to his family, and the rest of his brothers were very angry, bitter, and jealous people. They were so angry and bitter that eventually they were always looking for an opportunity. And when they found an opportunity, they seized it. They literally sold their brother to slavery and then pretended that he died so that Jacob wouldn't go looking after him. That's treachery on a whole different level. Don't do that to your family. That's mean. And then one bad thing after another happened to Joseph after that. That wasn't done. He got imprisoned, right? Then further trouble. If you know the story, like, there's the whole Potiphar wife, all that stuff. But through it all, eventually Joseph rises to power, second next to Pharaoh himself. And because of his power and influence in the kingdom, he eventually is able to save Egypt and Israel. The dynamic is this. The evil actions of his family is the reason why he's in Egypt. And then all the evil actions of everyone that he meets, the unfortunate events that happens, right, allow him to meet the right people, get in the right circumstances, and allow him eventually to climb the ladder, if you will. But also at the same time, Joseph's righteous actions throughout help him to be in the position that he needs to be to earn favor and so on and so forth. So all the things that was meant for evil, clearly Joseph says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. What Joseph is saying is this: God's will, his plan was accomplished, but it incorporated all the evil that you sowed, but he used it to do good. God is 100% at work, and what we do is 100% consequential and meaningful. Paul's version of this comes in Romans 8:28. You may know this famous verse. He writes, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. And Paul, as we've seen in these last 7 chapters of Acts, he clearly knows a thing or two about this, doesn't he? But notice the verse, because I think we make a few mistakes about understanding this verse. Notice that he does not say everything is good. No. Evil is evil. And the consequences of them are real and painful. Cannot minimize that. Also notice that Paul isn't saying that there's a silver lining to everything, that if you just look at something the right way, if you can find the right angle to look at this, you'll see the good in it. That's not what Paul is saying either. Again, evil is evil, and the consequences are indeed such. And then thirdly, notice that Paul isn't saying, in spite of the evil in the world or because of the evil in the world, God is working good for those who love him. As if every evil that is sown, God sows 2 goods, right, to counterbalance and activate. That's not also what Paul is saying either. What Paul is saying is that God works all things, good, bad, ugly, small, large, all of it. God works them all together, incorporates them into all of his plan, and then he will in the end accomplish all that is according to his plan and purpose. Now, if you're putting this all together in the context of storms and suffering, then what it means is that the storms in our life and the suffering are indeed a part of God's plan. I know that may be difficult to hear. That he can and he will incorporate them into our lives to accomplish his good. Again, it does not minimize that the suffering is suffering. It doesn't minimize that the storm is a storm, but indeed it can be and is a part of his plan, which means then I think it's safe to say that the purpose of storms in general is for good. It's what we call the providence of God. Now, let me give you an example in terms of how I understand how this all works, right? Because it may be a little confusing to you. I understand it actually through the way that my grandmother taught me how to cook. If you don't know anything about me, I love to cook and I love food, so on and so forth. And she taught me how to cook when I was a young boy. And probably some of you might relate. When I was a young kid, I would always go in the kitchen because my grandmother's always in the kitchen. I always try to sneak food and she would always feed me. And after a little while, she'd go, you know what, you're in here all the time. How about I teach you something? So one day she had a setup for me. I walked in the kitchen as I normally do, and there was a big old pot, and she was standing there. And she goes, come here, I'm going to teach you something. I was like, what? She goes, since you're always in here looking for food, might as well teach you something rather than just you eating food all the time, becoming spoiled. So today, I'm going to teach you how to cook. And today, we're going to make yukijang, which is a Korean stew. Delicious. It's one of my favorites, but it's actually pretty hard to make. So here I am. I'm, I think, 8. She's in the kitchen, and she's like, okay, let's learn how to cook. And I go, okay, tell me what to do. And she goes, no, you tell me what to do. And I'm like, excuse me, you're a crazy person. She goes, what do I need to add? I don't know. Tell me what I need to add. You know how this tastes like, right? And I was like, yeah. Well, then tell me how to add. Do you know how soy sauce tastes? Yes. Do you know how this tastes? Well, then tell me what to add. So I'd be like, okay, add whatever, soy sauce. She goes, okay, boom. And I'd be like, oh my goodness. And I would taste it. She goes, is that what you want to taste like? Well, it's missing something. What am I missing? Well, then add this, and then add this. And then every little bit, mind you, I'm telling her what to add, she's adding it in the amount that she knows. And then crazy enough in the end, I learned how to taste things and see what different things do to different flavors and all that kind of stuff. That's what she's trying to teach me. But at the end also, by the time we were all said and done, we had yukgaejang. And we ate my yukgaejang as an 8-year-old, and I was so proud. I thought it was the best ever. Probably biased because I made it and I struggled a lot through it, but it was still pretty good in my opinion. That's my memory, and I'm sticking to it. But that's how this works. God is God. My grandmother is such a master cook that she can do all of my stupidities as a cook and make it all work in the end somehow. So if I put too much of this, then she's like, well, I know how to counteract this, so I'll just put a little bit more of this. Remember, she's controlling the amounts, right? That's the beauty of it all. So God is incorporating all the things of our lives, all the good and the evil and all the small and the big and all that stuff, and he's going to incorporate them all. That's how his plan works. And so what we must remember then, if we're going to navigate the storms of our life in particular, is to know that God indeed has a plan, and this is how his plan works. Now, I could go on and on with the biblical examples of how this all works like this, because almost every biblical character, it seems, has notions of this in their story. Paul, David, Job, Peter, and of course, Jesus himself, and so on and so forth. I mean, Paul, we've been looking at him. Every single time he has a chance to preach the gospel, what does he do? Hey, by the way, I'm a Jew. I was born in Tarsus. I got educated by this guy, and then I was persecuting Jews. He tells the whole life story. Why? Because it's all a part of his journey. All of his evil, including the way he was imprisoning and killing Christians, right, is all a part of the reason why God brought him the way that it is. It's not all for nothing. Does that minimize what he... No. He killed people. That's still suffering. Bad things happen, but God can still incorporate them. Or David, we all love King David. Everyone knows that Jesus is from the Davidic line, right? The line of David. David had multiple wives. And the one that Jesus comes through is none other than Bathsheba. Most of us know the story. David is out on the balcony one day and he sees, unfortunately, or fortunately, well, however you look at it, unfortunately, a beautiful woman bathing. And she says, ooh, she kind of, okay. So come. And she forces her to commit adultery. I know, it's funny, but it's not funny. And then he impregnates her. And he tries to cover it up, but can't do it. And the only way he can cover it up is to literally send her husband, who has nothing to do with any of this, who is in the battlefield, front line of the battle, and then he kills him. And it's through that person that Jesus comes. Talk about incorporating things into the plan, no? And you see stories of this all throughout Scripture. And so, church, if we're going to then understand and remember, then at all times, but in particular times of trouble, we must believe and remember that God is 100% in charge and everything happens according to his will, and I cannot thwart his will. And yet, at the same time, what I do matters. Therefore, I ought to, with all wisdom and grace, live the best life, follow him as best as I can, trust in him, look towards him. Where does my help come from? From God. And then bring all that together, because if we do, then it'll help us to be like Paul, to understand God's plan accordingly. That we must be in every storm practical. Do the things we must do. If you're making mistakes and you know some of your habits are wrong and you're doing these things or you're in bad situations, you should get out of those things. Stop doing what you're doing. Paul says we got to dock or we're going to die. Those sailors, we need them or we're not going to be able to make it. That's practical. We should do the practical things. And yet at the same time, through prayer, we must believe and remember that God is God and he is doing his thing. And I cannot mess up his plan for me. And therefore, I always have hope. Everyone knows the famous Jeremiah 29, for I know the plans for you, plans to prosper you. If you go back and read Jeremiah 29, it's in the context of exile. He tells Israelites to go marry non-Israelites, which is like the biggest no-no ever. And he says, go marry them, have children, stay here. And through all of this, I've got plans to prosper you. Sounds like a terrible idea. No, God, I don't want to marry these foreigners. No, God, I don't want to do these biracial things. No, God, I don't want to do all these things. God says, do it. I have plans. Remember God's plan in and through the storm. Then second, relying upon God's presence. Now, as we've asked throughout Paul's suffering experiences so far in the last couple of chapters, the question that lingers is still the same. How in the world does Paul do what he does? Right? How? Like, how is he not losing hope? Everyone else lost hope. Everyone else is going crazy, chaotic, yet he's so calm, right? The sailors are like, I got to get out of here. Let's jump ship. Forget all these people. They can survive and let them die on their own. I'm not dying. I'm not going down with the ship. That's what they're doing. Paul says, no. You stay right here. But Paul's a prisoner, by the way. Prisoner leading the boat. Interesting. Well, how practically, for one, this isn't Paul's first rodeo, as you will. It's his third shipwreck. So he's been through this a time or two before. He's experienced. But having said that, let's be honest, that's not actually very helpful, because what it means is that if you want to survive a storm, you have to have first shipwreck first and survive that, gotten experience, then you can survive the next one, which means if this is the first shipwreck for you, sorry, not sorry, you know. And then also, we also have to be just very honest. Even if you do survive the first shipwreck of your life, not everybody comes out of them better than they entered it. Am I right? This idea that what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger isn't actually true. It can kill you. Let's be real. I know we like to say this and put these things up on Instagram or whatever, but I don't think anyone actually believes this anymore. And actually, I think, interestingly, Jesus would agree. He says in Matthew 7, the rains fall, the floods come, and the winds slam against everybody alike. But only the ones founded on the rock survive. So again, then, the question is, how? How does Paul do this? Well, the answer, as we said, is relying upon God's presence. But what does that mean? Well, interestingly, when Paul declares to everyone that they should have followed him and so on and so forth, but also they should not lose hope and keep courage, he tells them that the reason why he knows this is because the night before, an angel of God came to him, spoke to him, and said, hey, you're going to be all right. The boat's going to die, but you guys are going to be fine. So he goes, hey, don't lose courage. God's going to do what he said he's going to do. I believe him. But did you notice how Paul describes the God who tells him this? He says, for this very night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, therefore, stood before me. The God to whom I belong. This is very covenantal, promising, and possessive language. You know this. Whenever something or someone belongs to you, you will use particular pronouns. My, mine, ours. My mom, my brother, my wife, my child, so on and so forth. Our parents, our children, so on and so forth. No one dares speak this kind of possessive language unless you are fairly certain that the person you're calling mine or ours mutually feels the same way about you. It'd be awkward to call somebody your something and they don't feel the same way, correct? The person that you are claiming as mine is close and intimate to you. When you say my or ours, you're basically saying we belong together. And so Paul, what he's saying by saying the God who came and told me this, assured me that we were going to be okay, is the God whom I belong to, is saying no matter what happens, I know who this God is and I know exactly how he feels about me. I am his and he is mine. We are his people and he is our God. And if you read scripture, you'll see this covenantal language everywhere. It's actually the thing that makes the Bible, in my opinion, not just a bunch of words on a page. It's a letter from our God to his people. When God rescues Israel from Egypt, right, out of slavery, just before he gives them the 10 Commandments, right, you know what he says? He says, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of slavery. Up until that point, God never gave his first name to the people. But he gives us his first name. Why? Because that's how well we know him. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus teaches us, our Father who is in heaven. My Father. Abba, Daddy, Father. Our, possessive. You see then what Paul is doing here is very, very essential and critical. Because what Paul isn't doing is making the mistake that many of us might make in the middle of our storms. Because oftentimes, right, if we're being honest, in the midst of life's greatest storms, we'll think things like, God must be punishing me. He must be displeased with me. I must have done something wrong. I must be far from him, and this is how I'm paying for all of the wrong that I've done. I go visit college students or other people, and I go, hey, how you doing? Oh, it's good. And then eventually, I don't even say anything. Eventually, the conversation goes, yeah, I know. I'll come out to church. I know. I've been meaning to. And I was like, I didn't even say anything. The idea is, you're not happy with me because I don't go to church. And that's how we feel. Why? Because that's how we're actually trained in many ways to grow up. Our relationships, as much as we want to say that they're secure, they're actually not feeling as secure. When you don't do the things in a relationship, right, to keep up the thing, you also know that they start to break and they start to frail. And then using that my, our language seems a little bit... But Paul will not believe this, not with God, because he knows for a fact that God is always with him and therefore us. And how does he know? Because the Jesus who rescued him on the road to Damascus is Emmanuel, God with us. That God is one that is so with his people and belongs to his people that he tells Paul, who was literally persecuting, imprisoning, and killing his people, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? That's a oneness that we don't know about, do we? That he was hurting his people, and he says, no, you're not just hurting them, you're hurting me. That's how much we belong with him. And so if Jesus would then go pursue and rescue Paul, then no matter what storm is going to come, he knows that God is always with him and God is always with his people. Now at this juncture, we got to ask, well, okay, cool, that's Paul, but how can I be sure of this? Because often it just doesn't feel this way. And I get that you're telling me about Paul, and that's all good and all, but how can we be sure? This is where the other storm stories in the scripture is helpful. A little while ago, we went through the book of Jonah, and people know this story. But interestingly, we talked about it then, and I'll remind you now, that Jesus, in Matthew chapter 12, calls himself the true Jonah. He says, for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. He's saying, I'm Jonah. I'm the real Jonah. I'm the good Jonah. I'm the meant to be Jonah. And most of us know the story, but if you don't, let me kind of paraphrase. Jonah is a prophet, but not a good one. God goes to Jonah and says, Jonah, I need you to go to Nineveh. Nineveh is an enemy city. And he goes, I need you to go preach to them. They're being really bad. They're terrible people. And if they don't stop what they're doing, they're going to die. But I need you to go and warn them that it's going to happen. And Jonah goes, oh, heck no. He's a bit racist. And so he goes, no, I don't want anything to do with that. Those Ninevites, they all deserve to die. So he goes, no. You're not going to get me to go help those you-know-whats. And so he goes to the opposite side on a boat to Tarshish, literally to the opposite side of the world, it seems. And on the way, God is not happy with him. So he sends a storm, and the storm comes and eats the whole boat alive. And they're in the same kind of situation. Sailors are doing crazy things, throwing things overboard. What are we doing? They even start to pray. They start doing like the stick things and all that, And then after a little while, they were like, wait, Jonah's sleeping in the boat. Jonah, get up here. Pray to your God. What are you doing? We're all dying. What are you doing? And then Jonah knows what's going on. And he goes, fellas, I'm sorry. It's all because of me. I ran away from God. God is mad with me, so he sent the storm. So you just stop all you're doing. If you just throw me overboard, it's going to be all over. They're like, And so they're good people, better than Jonah, it seems. So they try to row even faster, but the storm's so crazy they can't go nowhere. And Jonah's like, dude, I told you, just throw me overboard, bro. It's going to be all right. So they're like, okay, throw him overboard. And the moment he sinks, the storm stops. And he sinks, and then he's eaten by the fish, and then he comes on land, right? That's the story. When Jesus compares himself to Jonah in this case, especially the 3 days in the fish for Jonah and 3 days in hell for Jesus, what he's saying is this. There's a storm that's coming for every single person. That's called death. Death because of sin. And that storm is a storm that you cannot control, and that storm is a storm that you cannot win, and that storm is a storm that you cannot survive on your own, because every human being is sinful. There's no one righteous, Paul tells us. And we all deserve this storm of God's wrath and the punishment for our sin, because if he's a just and righteous God, it's how it has to happen. But Jesus, in saying that I am the true Jonah, is saying this, but if you believe in me, and you believe that I love you, that I was sent for you, and through what I'm going to do on the cross, and for us, through what I've done on the cross, that I'm with you now and forever, and I've defeated the greatest storm that you cannot defeat, then you can trust that I'm with you. You can trust that God the Father threw me into the storm, and because of it, you can be saved. I got the suffering and the punishment that you deserve, that you couldn't take, but that I can handle. He's saying, so whatever storm you're going through, know that this isn't a punishment for something. No. I took the storm, Jesus says, the punishment storm. And that's the only storm that can be a punishment. You see, some storms are the result of our actions, right? Our consequences, our actions have consequences. Some storms are the result of just the crazy world that we live in. In a sinful world we live in, storms are going to happen. Other storms are the storms that God sends, as he does for Jonah. We call them severe mercies around here. But no matter what, all of those storms is not the storm. And therefore, God can use each and every single one of those storms to accomplish his good will. Because if God can use the greatest, most terrifying and life-altering storm called death forever because of sin, and he can take that and put all that suffering and punishment on his son and then grant us life after that, what is it that he cannot and will not do? So the thing that Paul knows, and the thing that we must remember, is that we must completely rely upon the fact that God is with us. If his with us says that in the greatest storm of life, in sin, he throws his son into it so that the storm will die, then how would God not be with us in all the other storms? Make no mistake, all the other storms are not the greatest storm. That's the idea. So let's then wrap it up and finish here, shall we? The difficulty of all of this, if we're just being honest, is that when we're going through storms, ourselves and others, we have difficulty in trying to guide them through it, right? We said, if you go, it's going to be okay, then you're just an insensitive, jerk, right? You should do better. But if you go, if you just don't point them to Jesus, then we're not actually really helping them in any way, right? So how do we then handle this? How do we remember God's presence and then rely upon God's presence, both for ourselves and others, in the midst of storms? Well, I think the story of Jesus and the disciples in the boat in Mark 4 that we refer to a lot is actually very helpful here. And may this be the take-home for you. Let me again reiterate the story. Jesus goes from one thing and says, hey, we got to cross the other side. Let's get in a boat and go. So they're crossing the Sea of Galilee. Okay, classically, it's a sea that has lots of storms and things like that. But the people that are in the boat are the disciples, and many of them are fishermen. So they know a thing or two about the sea. They're very familiar. But in the middle of their journey, a humongous storm arises. And the disciples are going crazy because they think they're going to die. And interestingly, just like Jonah, Jesus is chilling, sleeping on the boat. His head on a pillow, Mark says, which is a fascinating detail. And so they're doing all their stuff to get, they're throwing water over, whatever's happening, right? I don't know how storms go. They're doing all their things. And as they're doing it, they notice Jesus sleeping. So they're getting really angry. Because here's Jesus, their rabbi, their person, and he's doing nothing but sleeping. If it was a movie, I hope he was snoring, because that just make it more funny. And so Jesus, get up, bro. They're mad at him. They're like, we're dying and you're doing nothing for us. What are you doing? If you cared and if you loved us and if you were with us, then you would do something. Get up off your butt and help us so we can live. And then Jesus' reaction is, again, depending on how you look at it, it's either insensitive or ruthless or caring, but it's all, it's interesting. So he gets up. And then just imagine the scene. He gets up and the things are going crazy. And then he goes, hey, wind, how about you sit down? And how about you waves shut up? And then, poof. And then they're like, oh. And then he looks at them. And then I think if we have the right idea of Jesus, or the way that we think of Jesus, I think we're going to be like, okay, see? Don't worry. I love you. Hug. Everything's going to be okay. But that's not what Jesus does. He looks at him in the face and he goes, why are you so afraid? Where is your faith? Excuse me? Again, if I said that to you while you're going through this thing, you may want to do some not so nice things to me. Let's just be really honest. Where is my faith? Excuse me? Why was I afraid? Excuse you, right? That's the idea. But why does he say that? Well, see, when he says, where is your faith? He's not asking, why is your faith so small? He's asking, where have you put your faith? See, in that situation, everyone has a faith that they're putting it in. But it seems the disciples have put it on the wrong thing. Again, I get this from Tim Keller, and I've always used this, but he says, imagine that you're falling off a cliff. I know, really unfortunate situation, right? Because if you fall down at the bottom, you die. It's a storm, big one. And as you're falling, all of a sudden you look at the side of the cliff and you see this branch hanging out, right? Classic movie scenario that never happens in real life and is also can't really become true. And so, of course, you as a person that's falling to your death, you're like, oh wait, I gotta grab this, right? So normally you just be like, oh, I better reach out and grab it. But what he's saying is, in most of the storms in our life, oftentimes we don't look at it that way. Because in that thing, you're not thinking aloud. You're just like, I better grab on because if I don't, I die, right? No thinking, you just grab. It's instinctual. But in many of our storms, we actually look at it differently. We actually do some of these questionings. We go, what if that branch isn't strong enough? I got to find another one. There are no other branches. Or what if I don't have the grip strength to actually grab? Maybe I get my hand on it and then I'm going to die anyway, so what's the point? We do these things in life. But in the scenarios, it depends on where you put your faith. If the branch is strong enough, then that's all that matters in many ways. I know, the example is a little bit weird because, again, we have our grip strength. But if we put the faith in ourselves and our ability to do things, then guess what? You're not going to be able to grab that branch and survive. It's just not going to work. Physics. But if the branch is Jesus, and he can say, oh yeah, sin? Yeah, God's really upset about that. I'm going to take all of its wrath from the beginning of time, it feels like. Since the beginning of creation, Adam and Eve, I'm going to take all that wrath. He's going to put it on me, turn his face away. I'm going to go to hell for 3 days, and I'm going to get up and say, death, you ain't got nothing on me. If that's the branch, then you're good. Because the beauty of this branch, sounds really weird to say, it's got arms and legs, and he'll grab you rather than you going out to grab him. And you cannot fall, because he will not let you go. If that is the Jesus upon whom you have your faith, then he has every right to go, I'm in the boat. This nothing. I control this. I make this. I am the power. I'm with you now. Where's your faith? If you have it in me, you would not be afraid. Church, where is our faith? See, here's the beauty of all this, and we'll finish. If our faith is in ourselves, in the midst of our storms, if we're looking at ourselves all the time, then guess what? We're just going to suffer a lot more. There's no solution to that. If you had a solution to your storm, you would have figured it out and you would have been out of it by now. But if we look to Christ, and he is our answer, and he is our help, though the storm is difficult, we remember that he is with us, and he will take all of this and make it a part of his plan. He takes the evil, turns evil on itself, slaps evil in the face, and then uses the evil for our good. That's our God. Amen? So church, some of you may be going through a difficult storm in your life. Others of you might be coming out of a storm. Maybe you have storms in your life that you can't make sense of. Will you then remember that God, according to his plan, will work all things, including all the storms, for your good, if you love him and follow him, and you are his people. And that he is with you now and forever. Never to let you go, no matter how much you run. No matter even if you're killing the very people he died for, he will come after you. So will you then trust? Not blindly, but trust, because he is good. And he is God. Lord of the storms, King of all things, the one who is with you now and forever. Will you take some time to pray? Some of you for yourselves going through the storm. Others of you, there are people